isn't a dead word. How do I know the Scriptures is to be believed? Because Jesus Christ has told me so.
Before we get into this week's episode, I want to take a minute to tell you about this year's annual preaching conference at Westminster Seminary. It'll be on the 14th and 15th of October, and our theme for this year is the cross and the cost. As you may know, our mission here at Westminster is to train specialists in the Bible to proclaim the whole counsel of God for Christ and his global church. A key part of that is encouraging and developing our students as preachers and supporting those who are already in ministry, specifically in their preaching ministry. This year we'll be joined by Derek Thomas, Steve Nichols, and our very own David Garner as we explore our theme together. It should prove to be a time of great blessing and fellowship and rich teaching. You really ought to be here for it. There should be a link to register for the conference in the description, and I hope to see you there. We pray that God will bless us richly as we gather together on the 14th and 15th of October here at Westminster Seminary. Thank you.
This is the Westminster Podcast. My name is Nate Shannon. I'm the host, but I'm being hosted very kindly by Dr. Bill Edgar. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So by here, again, Dr. Edgar means in his home. So we've swapped the inglorious recording studio in the basement of the Westminster Library for these very hospitable conditions. So I'm glad to be here with you, Bill. And what I'd like to talk with you about, we want to do a couple of conversations with you about persuasion, which falls, we'll talk about it specifically, but of course it falls in the area of apologetics. Maybe it's synonymous with apologetics, but maybe it's not argumentation, maybe it's broader or than argumentation, maybe it includes argumentation, things like that. So I want to sort of get in the weeds with you on those concepts and how those things relate to each other. But first I want to say that we live in an age of abundance, right? And as regards Christian publication.
Yeah, there's a lot coming out. It's a cottage industry,
nonstop. It's difficult to keep up.
Yeah.
I don't know how everyone else feels, but I feel I can't keep up.
Yeah, I feel the same.
Yeah, and well, one of the disadvantages of that great blessing is that good works can be surpassed just because
And forgotten.
Imagine. No, I wasn't going to say that, but so I've been sort of re-inspired by your book, Reasons of the Heart: Recovering Christian Persuasion, which you published the year that I graduated high school.
Did I?
Yeah, and we don't have to say what year that was, but let's just ballpark it in the mid '90s.
Yes, that sounds right.
It is so, I've been thinking under the sort of shadow of Van Til and your teaching and Oliphant's teaching for something like 2 decades now, and I returned to this book recently, and was very encouraged that I feel very familiar not only with what's on the pages, but I have a sort of a sense now, thank the Lord and thank you and Oliphant, of the bigger theological picture of sort of what's what's behind it. Anyway, the point is that I think this is a very helpful book. I think it's very readable, but also it captures your approach to apologetics, which is very Van Tilian, very theologically aware and very biblically informed, but also 2 feet on the ground. So I think persuasion is a good word because of its maybe elusiveness, but also it's multifaceted. Persuasion, I think, is located in the complex matrix of human relationships. So I'll start there, and that's why I think this is important, because it captures that which I think is characteristic of your approach to apologetics and how you've taught it and practiced it in so many ways. I'm start this way because I know that you love flattery, Bill.
I hate it. I'm very modest. But that book I wrote during the years that I was moonlighting for a wonderful academy that had young people spend time there. And it occurred to me that while Van Til, whom I studied with ages ago in the 60s, was theologically right and for the time driven by the right sense of polemics, he was not today either well known or particularly good at persuasion. So one reviewer said of this book, it's a kinder, gentler Van Til. That I take as a great compliment, because I think that's exactly what I meant to do when I was writing it. So his shadow is all over, but so are the shadows of people like Francis Schaeffer, Os Guinness, many others who have influenced me since those times.
And that's evident on every page, the variety of influences and particularly those gentlemen whom you name, but others as well, namely J. Gresham Machen, the founder of Westminster, who said the following: "Modern culture is not altogether opposed to the gospel, but it is out of all connection with it. It not only prevents the acceptance of Christianity, it prevents Christianity even from getting a hearing." So Machen wrote those words in 1951. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is sort of hinted at in this statement by Machen. I'm going to put it this way: the context for persuasion. So what, we need to be, and you've always said this in your teaching, that apologetics is technically it's about answering questions, responding to questions.
Sure.
But an important component of it is asking questions.
Sure.
So we need to be aware of our surroundings in different senses. Would you say that?
I would. I mean, I have a mind experiment, which I'm sure you know about. I imagine one of my non-Christian friends or relatives sitting in the pew next to me in church and listening to our music, the prayers, the sermon. And after the service, I would ask him what he thought. And he wouldn't be hostile. He would just wonder what planet we were on. And I think that's exactly what Machen was getting at. It's not that people are necessarily hostile to it, although there's plenty of that, but it's that they don't know it, and so they're not informed. And because the reason they're not informed is we're not getting close to them. I think you were suggesting this. It's not just not asking them questions, but it's not having a context in which to ask questions where there's trust enough so that they'll feel, oh, I need to think about that. And, in recent years, I've been very, very interested in the post-Christendom world that we are in putatively. And some of the ministries that are the most effective in the post-Christendom world are, for example, a podcast like we're doing, or a radio program. Sermons, yeah, when you get to church and you're okay with it, but not as an entree. One of my friends who works in Amsterdam realized that you can't get people in the front door of the church anymore. But Amsterdam, contrary to what people think, is not hostile. It's just diverse, confused, all over the map. And so he started philosophical cafes. Now that sounds like a non-starter, but it's wildly popular. People come in, and he hopes that they'll ask deep questions. Why are we here? Why did children get leukemia? And that kind of thing. And he has a gift for giving answers to that as well as listening to their questions. And I am pretty persuaded that that is a helpful approach today. You don't want to give up church. That's what Christ told us he was building. But you want to go through the back door when people are more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I think I see what you mean, that there needs to be an on-ramp to church. Culturally speaking, we have to understand that those people around us who are not believing or practicing Christians are not necessarily ready to accept an invitation to a worship service. And worship services are not necessarily designed for outsiders.
Yeah, unfortunately.
You know. So our time, and you mentioned we live as kind of a post-Christian context. And I'm wondering what particular challenges, but I don't want to be only negative, what particular opportunities our time might offer, our particular, and of course we're speaking kind of post-Christian Western Europe, maybe North America in particular. So I think there are some challenges, but I also want to ask about, because in your book you talk about challenges, but you also point out the fact that there must be opportunities. We also don't want to idealize other periods as though the situation we're in now is difficult, wish we could go back to, and so on and so forth. Let me read something you wrote, again, when I was probably 18 years old. So you wrote the following: persuading our generation about deep issues is becoming more and more difficult as our culture moves away from certain shared assumptions and values. And today it is not only Christians who feel impotent sharing their deepest convictions. Whatever issue espoused, often the day is carried not by those who attempt the kind of persuasion that depends on careful reasoning and integrity, but by a power play, such as rage or the more subtle tyranny of the expert. In this atmosphere, many Christians whose convictions are strong and whose faith is foundational are understandably frustrated. Different barriers are raised, airtight arguments fall on deaf ears. In short, the Christian message seems irrelevant. You could have written that last week.
I know. I was thinking, what would I say if it was today? I just would have put it on steroids. Because today, not only are solid arguments not getting a hearing, but people are a whole lot more angry, a whole lot more hostile, a whole lot more suspicious than they ever were. And so it doesn't matter who you are. You may be a Christian, you may not, but you're not getting a hearing unless you're very, very persuasive. I carefully said, and I didn't say it back then probably, but I carefully believe now that we're in a post-Christendom era rather than post-Christian. And my, soapbox beef is that we were never Christian. We had influences from Christendom, some of them very good, some of them not so good.
And you're speaking about the country in which we are now.
I think our country, and you mentioned the West, I think that's more true of the West than of the majority world. I'm speaking of the West. And I think today, if I were rewriting this book, I would try to point out, just like you said, the negatives. Of course, they're there. People don't believe the gospel for all kinds of reasons. But also the positives, there are amazing opportunities. I mentioned this philosophical cafe. One of my favorite recent books is called The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. And he basically argues, whether we like it or not, the vestiges of Christendom are all around us, and we can't get away from them. A couple of years ago, right here in this little suburb, almost all our neighbors had a sign that said, "Hate has no home here." And you think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Where'd that come from? And most of them probably don't know, but it's right out of the gospel. People, while a minority fights contentiously for the rights of nonconformist people in practice, whether it be sexual or political or whatever, a lot of people who don't think about these things are nevertheless informed by, hey, this isn't right, or hey, why are they doing that? I mean, take the reactions as we speak to the militancy against Gaza, one that we understood at the beginning because Hamas attacked Israel. And now, I don't know what your views are, but one that has become over the top militant to the point where people are starving. And I don't want to get into the details, but if it's true, they're not being met by humanitarians. There's an outcry from people who may or may not know Christ. This shouldn't be. People shouldn't starve. So lots of opportunities. You know, when I try to speak the gospel to an unbelieving friend, or even to a believer, I try to say, you know, you're right. Where does this come from? And I'm not a natural law guy. I believe it's Romans 1, you know, God has made it clear. We don't like it, but it's still clear. As my colleague Dick Gaffin once said, apologetics is basically a reminder of who you are, which is pretty profound. So a lot of thoughts there, but I think if I were writing it today, I would be even more persuaded that people aren't reachable unless you circumvent the front door.
Yeah. Look, so you also wrote the following: one reason we are less effective, so kind of a disadvantage or sort of an encumbrance to persuasion contemporarily, is today is rooted in the belief that our age is absolutely unique and that barriers to believing the gospel are far greater than ever before. So pessimism can be discouraging. A pessimism can potentially undermine our witness or persuasion. So while we recognize that there are challenges that are distinct to our time, modern times or postmodern times or post-Trump, very specific sort of dynamic, and how much the world has changed and public discourse even since Trump was elected the first time. We live in a very sort of distinct time, and we want to recognize the challenges, but at the same time, we should not give in to pessimism.
No,
right?
very good. I mean, it's a balance. The parable of the wheat and the weeds, I think, is a great model here. If I remember him, Van Til used to say, the good gets gooder and the bad gets badder. So what we don't want to do is forget that there is a good, even though we're rightly alarmed about trends. I suppose this has to do with one's eschatology. For some reason, my premillennialist friends are declinists, almost all of them. I'm an amillennialist, which I don't like the term for, but it means Christ is reigning now, though we don't see the full success of his mission. And we have to recognize that things are going on now which are pretty good. I had a heart attack 10 years ago, almost to the day.
That doesn't go in the pretty good column. I assume that's not the end.
Depends who you ask. I'm kind of glad he's alive, I guess. Now, anyway, if it weren't for advances in medicine,
Right.
I wouldn't be here talking to you.
Yeah.
And just a few years before that, my dad, who had the same thing, died because they couldn't help him. So, I'm very realistic and pessimistic about certain things, but there's a lot of good stuff that's happening. C.S. Lewis, who is such a master of expressions, he once called this prejudice ageism. And what he meant by that was, it was better then. And he said, no, it was good then, and maybe better than we realize. But it's good now and it's bad now. So the book of Ecclesiastes has it right. It says something like, he who says the old days were better has vanity in his heart. So, yeah, I appreciate that. And you don't want to be a Pollyanna optimist because things are bad. But you don't want to so color what's going on that you sinfully ignore the wonderful things God is doing through the gospel.
And maybe there's a bottom line, thinking again of the parable, that it's in the Lord's timing. And if we are alive to talk about it today, that means the Lord says that there's work to do today, and our Father in heaven is still working. And so I think there's almost an imperative to optimism to say, thank the Lord for one more day of mercy. And if it were truly futile, then the Lord would bring it to a close.
He'd come again.
He'd come again. So I think we're here because the work is not yet done, because the Lord has work still for us to do. And you point that out. Again, we don't want to give in to a pessimism that can really undermine our own witness. You say we need a dose of historical honesty, looking carefully beneath the surface of what is apparently an age of faith, often reveals not only strengths but weaknesses. So
Yeah.
there can be a kind of whitewashing of history in some ways. Which
Exactly.
comes alongside of recognition of our problem. A new problem develops, we wish it hadn't developed, so we infer that before was better, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, you said something very helpful. There's work to be done. I would even say we're here by God's good grace. We don't always know all the reasons for it, but a day more is a day more of God's patience, grace, opportunity. And I have a pretty severe criticism of people who say, grit your teeth and wait to the end. Nothing less to be done. I'm not going to name any names, but there are people who say, well, we lost the culture wars. Let's just retreat and lick our chops and our wounds and wait till we get either an opportunity or the end comes. That's, to me, a lack of love for our neighbor. And God is giving us opportunities to love our neighbor that are unique to our times. And so we want to capitalize on that without, being naive that things are terribly wrong.
Right, and just if I could pull something from the Van Tillian lexicon, epistemological self-consciousness is meant to be important in our apologetic method. In other words, we might count to our advantage a clearer distinction between the gospel and not the gospel. So losing the culture war can, in itself, offer some opportunities, right? A clearer distinction. So we talk, for example, about the comparative difficulties of persuasion or apologetics in the Bible Belt versus, let's say, the Northeast or a less Christianized context.
Yeah.
And so if we're supposedly behind in the culture wars, doesn't that also mean that our message is more distinct?
Yeah, absolutely. When we first moved in here, I went to the post office, and this older gentleman who came to me and he said, "Oh, you're a theologian." He said, "What we need is a good war." I said, "You have not been through the war. I survived the war when I was young, and you don't want a war." But his point was, out of the darkness, light, well, I hope that was his point, could become manifest, So I think your view is well taken, that while we hate the loss of lots of things, that can make the good things shine brighter because they're unique. My dear, wonderful colleague, Scott Oliphant, who's from Texas, said, "When there's light, there's bugs." And I would say, when there's bugs, we see them because there's light. We're in a unique time. There are a lot of anxiety-producing elements to it, but we're also in a time of opportunity. And I don't need to enumerate them for you, but because you're living in this. But think of what's happening in the majority world. Think of how people are embracing the gospel who never did before. Yeah, there are problems. Yes, it's not deep as it should be. But it's an amazing time when the gospel is spreading as it once may have done in Europe.
Yeah, so on that point, I know you spent much of your career with one foot in two different continents, right? So okay, give us a little, just sort of a survey of what's happening, maybe particularly in France. Do you see similar dynamics I mean, French is very much more post-Christian and is much more comfortable in its post-Christendom
There you go.
culture. And do you see similar dynamics, just in terms of interacting with people, apologetics and persuasion? Are there similarities and differences between what we're seeing in the United States?
Oh, yeah. I mean, enormously so. Okay, the Christianity of the United States, while it has many, many wonderful attributes, can be a facade. Tim Keller of blessed memory used to say, in the North, the problem is we're postmodern, we need absolutes, we don't know what's true. In the South, the problem is we go to church and we have a Christian culture and we turn it into moralism. Now, this is a huge generalization, but since I was born in the South, I have a right to say a lot of the people I grew up with were good people, but moralistic. God must love me because I haven't been all that bad. In France, where I grew up most of my life and spent a lot of my adult life, you find some of that because of Catholicism. But you also have tremendous opportunities to say, you know, let's not fool ourselves. We don't have, we shouldn't go to moralism. We should just say that hasn't worked. And if there's a God, we don't earn his approval. So in one way, France is farther down the road to the weeds. In another way, the opportunities have never been more rife. Now, you may wonder, well, where, you know? Well, there's a lot of signs of hope. Curiously, the Roman Catholic Church, which has had so many issues, is now in resurgence, particularly among young people. So go figure. Meetings, ceremonies, jamborees. Young people are coming in droves, and it's all headed by the Catholic Church. Okay, I'm not a Catholic, but that can't be all bad. And then I worked for 11 years and still am attached to a little seminary in Aix-en-Provence. And they're producing leaders for the kingdom by thorough and painstaking instruction in Reformed theology. And, you know, that's not been so obscure that people will be hostile. A few years ago, John Calvin, we celebrated the 500th anniversary of his death, and or maybe his birth, I don't know. But anyway, 500th anniversary. And a lot of French people woke up to the fact, wait a minute, this guy was French. You know, we think he's Swiss. So our seminary renamed itself Faculté Jean Calvin, partly in order to say, hey, we're French, Calvin was French, put two and two together and listen, you know. And it was not the best choice maybe, but that's one of the signs among many of opportunities. The other great opportunity in France and in much of Western Europe is that immigrant churches from former colonies are formed because the people who bring their skills and their talents to try and find opportunity also bring their Christian experience. And so in Paris, where I grew up, there are these lively worship services run by Africans. And French people look in on this and they say, wow, this is amazing. Maybe I'll try it out. So I don't want to be overly optimistic. I think we have huge obstacles, but French culture is, while further down the road and in some ways can be extremely hostile, surprisingly open to opportunities.
Interesting. And one thing you mentioned previously in a conversation we had off the air, Bill, the Roman Catholic Church has taken to presenting itself almost in evangelistic terminology. So what you hear is not sort of clericalism. The language they use is adopted from Protestantism, from evangelicalism very often, which I think indicates their understanding or consciousness of the fact that the people want something inspiring and encouraging. The people want hope.
That's such a good point. Yeah, well, it's certainly true that the reputation for being a clerical hierarchy has been earned. But I think the present leaders in the Catholic Church, despite all the problems that there have been with abuse and everything, want to put a face on it which is attractive. And yeah, they probably stole some of that from us. Some of it just comes from obvious, clear observation. And it's just exciting. Now, put into the mix things that are much less exciting. For example, I mentioned the immigrants coming with their Christian faith. Many of them in France are coming with a vague cultural Islamism. And so that's presented huge challenges because French people pride themselves on being egalitarian. And suddenly there's a society that says, no, egalitarianism is wrong, and they don't know what to do with it. So there's a lot of confusion, and there'll probably be hostility against Muslims and maybe naive openings. It's hard to say. So we've got great challenges in France, probably in a way we don't quite have in the States.
Maybe the greatest challenge, Bill, is just the fact that things change constantly. And,
Yeah.
as soon as you think you got the tune, the song changes.
Yeah.
And so I think adaptability maybe is key. I want to ask you about postmodernism, and I think it's fun to blame the French for postmodernism, but it wasn't as though we haven't welcomed it, and it's interesting that maybe there's some primary literature that you can point to and say, well, here's where postmodernism sort of began, but it has definitely borne different fruit in the United States as it has in France or in Western Europe. There's definitely an American postmodernism or distaste for modernism or whatever it might be. But I think it's another instance of, here are some obvious problems. Things we depended on are taken away from us, universals or objective truths and things like that. But again, we want to be open, adaptable, responsive, and we want to see what opportunities might postmodernism offer, whatever it is. So here's what you wrote. There is much that is appealing in the vision of the postmodern present as a great opportunity for the gospel. Human reason as a rigid, universal standard is not finally compatible with a sovereign creator God. But the end of the age of reason is not necessarily the beginning of the age of faith. For one thing, at the heart of the postmodern mentality is a culture of extreme skepticism. The postmodern condition, as French theorist François Lyotard calls it, is one in which what he calls the grand narrative, the grand narrative, the meta-narrative is ruled out. There is no more truth. There is no more great key to the meaning of life. According to many postmodernists, knowledge is no longer objective, nor even useful, and ethics is not universal. That's one thing I think that has changed, that ethics seems to have replaced reason. So my question for you is, what does that mean?
Yeah, well,
is postmodernism still with us?
If you got a couple of weeks, I'll try. We're not conversant the way we were 20 years ago with postmodernism. 20 years ago, it was obligatory to have that word in every speech, every article, every sermon. Today, it seems to be passé, or is it? I once asked a friend who's part of the deconstruction movement, is postmodernism still alive? He said it's dead, but you'll find it everywhere. And I think what he was saying is that the mentality that this cultural shift created is bigger than and has surpassed the use of the term and the concentration on what it means. But the general reasons for its appeal are very much with us. So what are they? Well, I probably shouldn't take the time to do that, but at the beginning, and you mentioned Lyotard, and he was a leader in it. There were others. It was a reaction not so much against Christianity, but against the Enlightenment. Now, some people threw the gospel into it because they considered it a grand narrative, which it is, and they were suspicious of all grand narratives, which is a trait of postmodernism. Mm-hmm. But what Lyotard was mostly suspicious of was Marxism, Freud, these great narratives that tell us how wonderful we are and don't put into question. He, if you'd asked him, he probably would have said, oh yeah, well, Christianity's in there, but that wasn't his main beef. So I've always maintained that whatever the causes of postmodernism, which are still with us, they bring opportunity. You have to be careful with this. I mean, my mentor, Cornelius Van Til, touted Christianity as a unique worldview. And many people said, great, uniqueness is back. We have a platform, you know. I actually don't think so. I don't think uniqueness is back. I think the gospel may be back. But they called Van Til a postmodern ahead of his time. I don't think Van Til would have liked that because he wasn't postmodern. He was unique, to be sure, but his appeal was not the gospel is unique. His appeal was the gospel is true. Mm-hmm. So I thought I'd throw that out there because, yes, the postmodern atmosphere brings opportunities, but be very careful not to make the gospel a kind of option.
The sort of the first among many.
Yeah, the best option.
Yeah. So you conclude this chapter as follows. In sum, there never was a golden age when evangelism was easier. Today is no better, though no worse, than other times. To be sure, every era has different characteristics, needs, and challenges, and thus Christian apologetics must be alert to the peculiarities of an epoch. But the reason that today or any day represents a special opportunity, the reason that apologetics is relevant, is not primarily because we have a good understanding of the cultural context, as interesting and helpful as that might be. Rather, it is because of the message. And this is what you just said, Bill. The good news of the gospel. By definition, it is fresh and even surprising. If nothing is new under the sun in human history, the message itself, coming from another world not ruled by the sun, is fresh in every way today. Amen. That's great. I want to go back to one of the first things you said,
okay,
which is, you hinted at the importance of human relationships, and that being, to use a relevant term, sort of a trump card, in persuasion. In other words, unending complexities and constant flux of our sociocultural, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end, we have to create real opportunities, which means having relationships with people. So in the end, it's kind of all about people, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Those are great lines. I'm happy to say I still agree with myself. How to respond to that? Let me give you an incident that has marked me a lot. Dr. Lilback, president of Westminster, and I are presently engaged in what we're calling the Legacy Project. And we're interviewing all these great saints from the past, mostly from the past, about what's going on, what do they appreciate about Westminster, what are they critical about. And one of the most recent ones was an interview of Dick Keyes, who I roomed with him in seminary. I was in his wedding. I named my son after him, so very close friend. Dick and I took different paths. Everyone thought I would be a L'Abri worker, and I turned out to be an academic. Everybody thought he'd be, probably a good pastor, and he turned out to be a L'Abri worker. Anyway, at the end of this fascinating interview, Dr. Lilback asked him, is there anything you would add to the seminary curriculum to make it better? Because he had said very appreciative things. And he said, yeah, community. Classrooms, grades, dormitories, that's all good. But at L'Abri, much of the best work we do is late night by the fire when somebody's crying over a family issue or something. And you can't manufacture that. The seminary is a seminary. It's not a resident community. But I think that's to go back to what you said about being human. The opportunities today to do apologetics are less about, I've got an airtight argument. I mean, we need good arguments, but that's just people, that's not where they are. And it's much more about, are you there for your neighbor who's going through a divorce or who's going through the death of a relative? Or what? Are you not, you don't have to preach at them. You just have to be there. Just like Job's friends. They did something right at the beginning, and then they were off the wall. They sat with him. They said nothing. And that's what you need. So, apologetics is, we rightly quote 1 Peter 3:15, be ready to give an answer. But I think we wrongly narrow answer down to theological treatise, airtight logical argument, whatever it might be. Those are important. Those can be very important. And in the history of apologetics, they were probably the majority. But today, in such a broken world, going over to help your neighbor get through a crisis, that gets you a hearing. And then you can begin to say, well, I love you. The reason I love you is because God loves me. So just a preaching point. Today, to get the gospel across in a post-Christendom era, our community relations are as effective or more than how sound our arguments are. Now, I've been spending my life doing sound arguments, so I'm not against them. But, the people who reached me, it really wasn't because of a sound argument. It's because they cared for me. Yeah. And I want to do the same for everybody else.
Yeah. Bill, one of my favorite parts of your book, Reasons of the Heart, is not really a part of the book, and that's the dedication.
Oh, what did I say?
So I'm going to ask you to read the dedication and then tell us about it.
All right. To Pierre and Hélène Courtial, whose vibrant faith is the best apologetic. So let me unpack that. Pierre Courtial was a pastor of a huge church in Paris. And at the age of 60, we foolishly asked him to come and be the dean of a brand new seminary because he would lend it respectability. And he foolishly said, yeah, I'm 60. I've done parish work. I'd like to try this. So he came down and he lived in the seminary with his wife. And he did exactly what we had hoped and far more. He was the anchor, the solid voice, the point of reference for so many of us younger people who, were probably right in what their convictions were, but they lacked his sense of pastoral care and presence. So they marked us. And when I say us, Paul Wells, Pierre Berthoud, many of the younger people, Peter Jones. If it hadn't been for Pierre, I don't know what the seminary would be like, because he was the great father of our enterprise. And when he retired, he left the seminary in very good hands. So the transition was easier than it could have been. But it was a hard day because, Daddy was gone. And so I dedicated this book to him because, as the title shows, Reasons of the Heart, I am profoundly convinced that apologetics is, yes, about sound arguments. And Pierre had very sound theology. I taught a course with him, and it was astonishing, his knowledge. But he had this warmth, this pastoral care, this love of people. And I want that to be the lead-in, or at least one of the most important ones, to hearing the gospel.
That's great. Thank you so much, Bill.
Oh, sure.
This is the Westminster Podcast.
This has been a podcast of Westminster Media. Westminster Media is a ministry of Westminster Theological Seminary. If you would like to join us in our mission to train specialists in the Bible to proclaim the whole counsel of God for Christ and His global church, please visit www.wts.edu/donate. This podcast was hosted by Nate Shannon and edited by Brandon McLean Smith.